Good evening. I'm Bill Goldstein. I'm the program curator here at Roosevelt House, and I welcome you here on behalf of Harold Holzer, who's the director of Roosevelt House, but at the moment is in Kansas, and on behalf of President Jennifer Rabb, who is the president of Hunter College, and I don't think is with him in Kansas, but is not in New York. So welcome. I am here to do a somewhat bifurcated introduction. I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, whom we are honored to have here, and then I am going to introduce a colleague, Leah Garrett, who is the director of the Center for Jewish Studies, which is the co-sponsor of the event here tonight. So our speaker is Robert Mnookin, and we are, as I say, honored to have him. He is the Samuel Williston Professor of Law and chair of the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School, and he is also the director of the Harvard Negotiation Research Project. You can read more about him in his program. He combines a great number of skills that it would seem are highly necessary in every family, business, community, government, internationally, and he seems to have become an expert in all of those realms. I think he's the author of 10 books, the author-editor of 10 books, and it's an interesting thing, I think, that he is an expert in conflict resolution, and the title of his book presents a paradox, the Jewish American paradox. So how he resolves that paradox is perhaps a sign of his skill in other conflict resolution. We will find out more about that very soon. I want to thank, in particular, Peter Osnos, who is a board member at Roosevelt House, for helping us to arrange the event. He is wearing several hats sitting in the front row here. He is a board member. He is also the publisher of Robert Mnookin's book. He is the founder of Public Affairs Books, and we are very grateful to him for shepherding the book and Professor Mnookin to us. Before I turn the microphone over to Leah Garrett, I want to thank Congressman Jerry Nadler for being here tonight. And also, I want to thank Joyce Miller, who is a professor in our public policy program, who is also Mrs. Nadler, I suppose, but Ms. Miller. I should have said also that Peter Osnos wears another hat here at Roosevelt House. He actually teaches in our human rights program. So we have professors from the two curricular programs, and we have Leah Garrett, who will talk to you a bit about the new Center for Jewish Studies, of which she is the director. So Leah, please come up. And after Leah speaks, as I said, Robert Mnookin will take the podium. Thank you all for being here. Oh, after Professor Mnookin speaks, we will have a reception and book signing just outside the auditorium, and you can continue the Q&A that we will have with Professor Mnookin as you ask him to sign your books. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I promise I will just be literally 2 minutes. I wanted to introduce myself. I recognize a lot of faces in the audience, but I'm the new director for the new Center for Jewish Studies, because believe it or not, Hunter did not have one, and I've been working day and night to build up a really strong new program in Jewish Studies. I'm going to tell you a minute's worth of what I've been up to. The main thing I've been up to is building an interdisciplinary program, because I feel Jewish Studies should be all over the curriculum in history and in sociology and in English. So we have a range of people teaching in a range of places, but one of the things we're really focusing on is Jewish New York, which means we're doing courses every semester on the history of New York. We're doing a course this semester, an experiential learning course, which I think some students are here from today, where they do walking tours of different parts of the city to learn about our history. The other thing that I'm doing for the center is building up a lot of connections, both within the university and beyond. So we're doing monthly lunches with scholars who come in and speak to students and faculty and members of the community and talk about a range of Jewish studies subjects. as well as a lot of evening programming. So we're doing lots of really fun, interesting things. We really want the community to be involved with what we're doing. So if you're interested, just go to the Hunter Center for Jewish Studies website. Everything's on there. And email me or the website. We'll add you to our mailing list, and hopefully we'll see you at all of our events and our monthly lunches. And it's a really great introduction for those of you who don't know it to Jewish New York and the history of Jewish studies as well. So thank you, and I'm very excited to secondly introduce Professor Mnookin for his talk. So thank you.
Well, what a pleasure to be here in New York, and I'm thrilled that you've all come out on this beautiful day. I am not a professional Jew, and indeed what was not said in the introduction is really the puzzle that I chose to write a book like this. Indeed, I really spent much of the last 3 or 4 years working on this book, and I'll say a little more about why I did it later. But my field is conflict resolution and negotiation. And I had this program in negotiation. And indeed, I wanted to entitle the book Negotiating Jewish Identity in Contemporary America. But my publisher didn't like that title. And he's a better negotiator than I am. It also turns out, for those of you who are authors, if you read your contract carefully, authors have a say in titles, but you do not have the complete say in all events. I'm very grateful to Peter Osnos, who's been an extraordinary supporter of this project. My book is about the puzzling nature of Jewish identity and the challenges facing the American Jewish community. In a few minutes this afternoon, what I really want to do is simply share 2 personal stories, which are reflected in the book, and say a bit how they illustrate the notions of identity and Jewish, both of which are very slippery terms. The first story, which in fact involves the first chapter of the book, is about one of the world's most influential theorists on the subject of identity, Erik Erikson. I first met Erik Erikson in 1975. At the time, he had retired as a Harvard professor, and with his wife, Joan, had moved to Tiburon, California. And I was fortunate enough, as a young guy, I was a beginning law professor with interdisciplinary interests, to be asked to be part of a faculty seminar of sorts of 12 people who met once a month at someone's home in Marin County. Erikson was working on a book having to do with adult development of people now my age, sort of his 8th and final stage. And most of the other people were rather distinguished psychoanalysts and psychologists, considerably older than I was, certainly more experienced. I was a law professor, and at the time I had done a fair amount of research and writing on children in the law, and was, to that extent, very interested in issues of human development. And I leapt at the opportunity to join this group and to learn more about identity and human development. When I'd been a student at Harvard in the 1960s, Erikson had been a faculty celebrity. I didn't meet him in Cambridge, and I did not take any courses from him, but many of my friends did. He was a bit of a legend. He'd been trained in Vienna as a child psychoanalyst by the Freuds themselves, primarily Anna Freud. And he was a professor of human development and a lecturer in psychiatry. His perpetually oversubscribed undergraduate course at Harvard was called Social Sciences 139, the Human Life Cycle, and it was popular for being very interesting, and as I recall, not terribly demanding, but fun. Erikson's worldwide influence sprang from his developmental model of identity, which posited that we work through particular challenges over 8 life stages. Freud's original theory of development had not extended past the years of early childhood. Erikson had coined the concept of an identity crisis, which related to an adolescent's struggle to develop a strong and cohesive sense of self. Erikson had championed the idea that a person's cultural context influenced his identity development. And indeed, he had written best-selling biographies of Martin Luther and Gandhi, and in a sense established the genre of what was called psychobiography. Although in this seminar, I cannot claim to have really gotten to know Erikson well, but I immediately took a liking to him. At the time, he was 72. He was a handsome man with blue eyes, a light reddish complexion, and a striking mane of beautiful white hair, which you can see here. Although courtly, he dressed informally. Like my own grandfather, George Sittenfeld, he wore a Western string tie with a striking piece of jewelry as a clasp. Soft-spoken, he had an accent that sounded German to me, and from his name and appearance, I assumed he was Scandinavian. During the time this seminar was meeting, Dale and I were invited to a small dinner party that the Eriksons attended. And Dale was seated next to Erik Erikson. Early in the evening, Erikson asked her what kind of name Mnookin was. When she told him the name came from a Hebrew word meaning at rest or peaceful, he asked Dale, "Are you Jewish?" When she replied that she was, he said, "You don't look Jewish." Then, as if to explain his questions, he said with apparent modesty, "I write about identity, you know." What neither of us knew at the time was the importance Erikson himself attached to not looking Jewish and not having a Jewish name. We found out that only by chance shortly after this dinner party, when Erikson suffered a crisis relating to his own complicated and confused identity. The crisis was triggered by a New York Times book review with the provocative title, Erik Erikson, The Man Who Invented Himself. This front page story in the March 30, 1975 Sunday Book Review included a beautiful photograph of Erikson with his magnificent head of white hair. It was written by Marshall Berman, a City College professor and a Harvard PhD who had studied with Erikson. And the review was presumably of Erikson's most recent book called Life, History, and the Historical Moment, a collection of essays, most of which had been published before. The first paragraph of the review gave no hint of what was to come. In fact, it could not have been more complimentary. It said, Erik Erikson is, quote, probably the closest thing to an intellectual hero in American culture today. He talked about the striking phrases he had asked, and he said what important work he had done with children. Several paragraphs later, Berman revealed what for me was a complete surprise. Quote, like many of the outstanding intellectuals of our time, he wrote, Erikson grew up as a Jew in Imperial and Weimar Germany and crossed the water to America during the Hitler years to fulfill a vital inner need. Berman argued that Erikson's inner need was to abandon his Jewish and American refugee status and reinvent himself as a man of Danish Gentile ancestry. Berman's harshest criticisms focused on what Erikson had omitted from an autobiographical essay in the book entitled Identity Crisis: An Autobiographic Perspective. Berman claimed that what he had written illustrated bad faith, and he mentioned four things. First, he said Erikson cannot bear to say that he is a Jew. In the essay, Erikson had acknowledged that his stepfather, Dr. Theodor Hamburger, was Jewish and that Erikson had been raised as a Jew. But Erikson had failed to state that his mother, née Carla Abrahamson, was Jewish too. Second, that Erikson had changed his surname as an adult after having grown up with Hamburger's name and having been raised in the household. The name change, according to Berman, represented Erikson's, quote, repudiation of his stepfather, whose Jewish name he should normally bear, though he kept his stepfather in the background as the vestigial H, Erik H. Erikson, in his name. Third, that the new surname Erikson had chosen was not his birth father's name. No one ever knew who his birth father was, but rather a name he'd made up, drawing on his own first name. Berman noted, Quote, the cosmic chutzpah of his claim to be Erik Erikson, his own father, in the most literal sense, a self-made man. Fourth, he said Erikson didn't admit that he'd been a refugee. By refusing to confront himself as a Jew, Erikson represses at least one experience of dreadful suffering we know he went through. He was a victim of Nazism. Now, the review did more than accuse Erikson of dishonesty about his Jewish heritage. It suggested that in invading or denying his Jewishness, Erikson was inauthentic and had lived his life inconsistently with his own developmental theories, which emphasized wholeness, a concept that, according to Berman, means that we should strive to accept our pasts, our parents, our diverse and disparate impulses and needs and yearnings, instead of rejecting and repressing the parts of ourselves we fear. The seminar met again shortly after the Berman review appeared, and Erikson himself was not present, and sometime soon thereafter, it was in fact disbanded. I suspect Erikson was embarrassed and shaken by his review. Indeed, his biographer suggested that it had been a very upsetting blow. The rest of us in this seminar, many of whom were Jewish, were stunned by the intensity of Berman's attacks. We discussed what, if anything, members of the group might do individually or collectively to show support for Erikson. The consensus was that whatever the underlying facts, Berman had unfairly attacked Erikson's character. What we in the seminar did not discuss were the issues relating to Jewish identity that arose, at least for me, from Berman's review. Berman seemed to assume that the way to determine whether someone was Jewish was to apply the matrilineal principle of Jewish law. Erikson's mother was Jewish, therefore Erikson was Jewish. It was all about descent. But did that mean he had to forever be Jewish? Was his biological father's background of no relevance? Was Erikson not allowed to forge his own identity? Moreover, I wondered, had Erikson converted to Christianity, and if so, wouldn't that be relevant to his identity as a Jew? Like the others in the group, I was unwilling to criticize Erikson. I wanted to have more facts. My guess was that Erikson no longer thought of himself as Jewish, and because of anti-Semitism, was reluctant to be publicly identified as a Jew. But no one in our group posed the most troubling question, that this admired man, dedicated to identity and wholeness, was he a self-hating Jew? I was raised to believe that it was wrong to try to pass as a Gentile. But when I think about Erikson, I wonder, is it always wrong? What if a person feels no connection to Judaism as a religion or to the Jewish community? What if the burdens of anti-Semitism become unbearable, as they may have been for Erikson growing up in Europe? Why should it be wrong to stop identifying yourself to others as Jewish under such circumstances? In other words, why shouldn't you be allowed to opt out? Questions like these led me now, some 40 years after my encounter with Erikson, to study in more detail both the various strands of his identity as an entry point into my own grappling with what it means to be Jewish. What standard of membership should apply to the American Jewish community today? Who should count as a Jew? In addition to matrilineal descent, there are several traditional ways of thinking about Jewish identity. As a religion, as sometimes as a race, as an ethnicity, do these ideas define a standard that makes sense in today's America? If not, how do we usefully define the boundaries, or do we need them at all? I want to briefly now tell you a second story, which also really planted a seed for this project. This took place at a family dinner in Oxford, England, a little bit later in the 1970s, when I was on my first sabbatical from the University of California, Berkeley, where my daughters forced me to confront the puzzling question of who counts as Jewish and my own ambivalence. My wife Dale and I had enrolled our two daughters, Jennifer, then 11, and Allison, 8, in English schools. There are some here who know us. As you can see, this was many years ago. Allison is the dark-haired daughter, Jennifer is the redhead. Over dinner one night at the start of the school year, Jennifer told us about her new class, Religious Education, RE, taught by Miss Kay, the formidable headmistress. Jennifer reported that Miss Kay began the class by asking, "Who here is of the Anglican faith?" Nearly all the girls, according to Jennifer, raised their hands. Miss Kay then asked who was Presbyterian, Catholic, Baptist. A few more hands went up for each. Finally, Miss Kay turned to the class and asked, "Is anyone here not of the Christian faith?" I asked Jennifer what happened next. Well, I raised my hand, and Miss Kay asked, "And what are you, my dear?" I told her I'm Jewish. Miss Kay paused for a second and then said, "Oh, how interesting." Then she asked whether my parents would object if, as part of this course, we read parts of the New Testament as well as the Old Testament. I told her you would not object. Dale and I told Jennifer that she had responded quite appropriately, trying to be psychologically sensitive. I then asked, "How did you feel about all of this?" Jennifer looked hard at Dale and me and then asked, "When are we going to become Jewish?" Dale and I were a little stunned. I responded, no doubt defensively, "Your mother and I have always thought of ourselves as Jewish. We're not really religious, but we are Jewish." Implicit in Jennifer's challenge was, what does it mean to be Jewish? Who should count as a Jew? Left unsaid, but implicit in my response, was the idea I'd grown up with. Being Jewish was not a thing that you needed to choose to become. You just were, whether you liked it or not. By birth, Dale and I were Jews, therefore so was Jennifer. Descent alone was enough. Well, one thesis of my book is that for my grandchildren's generation, this will no longer be true. To her credit at the time, Jennifer was not satisfied with my response to when will we become Jewish, and she shot back, "You know what I mean." "I'm not sure I do," I responded. And she said, "I want to have a bat mitzvah." Dale and I looked at each other baffled. Where had this idea come from? Not from us. Neither Dale nor I had ever been bar or bat mitzvahed. We had grown up in the Midwest in the 1950s in highly assimilated families. Our parents and grandparents were longtime members of a Reformed Jewish congregation, which at the time, the high water mark of Reformed Judaism then in the Midwest, did not celebrate bar and bat mitzvahs, at least in Kansas City or St. Louis. No Hebrew school for us. Instead, like our Protestant friends, we'd been sent to Sunday school at Temple until 10th grade when we were confirmed. Twice a year, our parents took us to services on the high holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We received presents for both Hanukkah and Christmas, the latter celebrated as a secular holiday with gifts under a Christmas tree. To that point in our children's lives, we had done even less in terms of providing a religious education. We had not bothered to join any congregation, even after the children were born. Neither of us felt any urge to become observant, and unlike the Midwest of the 1950s, we felt no community pressure to join a synagogue or temple. Indeed, in the book, I described that one of the 4 challenges facing the American Jewish community is illustrated in a sense by that aspect of our lives. Like many American Jews, our commitment to Judaism as a religion was thin. Indeed, I discover that one of the challenges facing our community is that the overwhelming majority of American Jews 95% report they take pride in being Jewish, but with the exception of the Orthodox, we American Jews are less observant than our Christian neighbors, at least as measured by attendance at religious services or membership in a church or synagogue. Many Jews are not believers. Pew reported that nearly half of its respondents who identified as Jews said they were agnostic or did not believe in God at all. 22% of them, Pew labeled as Jews without Judaism, Jews without religion. And that figure, Pew found 22% overall, balloons to about a third among millennials. Let me turn to the second challenge facing the American Jewish community. And here I have a story about the youngest of our 4 grandchildren, Eli Alcott. And it illustrates a second challenge facing the American Jewish community. The name on Eli's birth certificate is Cornelius Olcott VI. Indeed, the motivation for writing this book is when, as a grandfather, I realized that part of me really hoped that Cornelius Olcott VI would grow up to think of himself as Jewish. Now, with our enthusiastic blessing, our daughter Allison married a wonderful young man, Corey Olcott, whose real name is Cornelius Olcott V, needless to say. And it's also needless to say that Corey was not raised in the Jewish faith. This was not a big deal to Dale or me, nor were the Olcotts concerned that Allison was Jewish. That Allison married someone who is not Jewish is hardly exceptional. Today, among Jews in America, intermarriage is the norm, not the exception. The statistics are remarkable. Since the year 2000, 57% of American Jews who married wed non-Jews. Indeed, if you put aside the Orthodox, who represent 10% of the American Jewish world, the percentage is above 70%. This represents a stunning change. Traditional Jewish law prohibited intermarriage. Indeed, among observant Jews, they would sit Shiva, say the prayer for the dead for someone who married outside the faith. In my grandparents' generation, intermarriage for Jews was exceedingly rare. The estimates are that it was about 2% in the first decades of the 20th century. There was steady and now explosive growth. In my parents' generation, intermarriage was unusual. In Dale's and my generation, it was becoming much more common, but it was still the exception. Now, for our children, even for our children, of course, and for the children of our contemporaries and those who are younger, it's the norm. It's not the exception. As I say, the statistics plainly show this. Now, many Jews believe intermarriage is the greatest threat to American Jewish continuity and survival. Until recently, American Jewish leaders, including nearly all rabbis, focused discussion on how to prevent or discourage intermarriage. I disagree with this approach. In my book, I argue, in fact, that although this may work to inhibit Orthodox youth, as a general strategy, I think it's doomed to fail, and if anything, is counterproductive. To my mind, the issue is not how do we stop intermarriage. It's what are we doing to engage the next generation. The challenge is how best to welcome and integrate those families into the Jewish community, and more importantly, how to nurture a Jewish identity in their children. In the Reform and Reconstructionist movement today, I'm happy to report that intermarriage is now approached to a much greater degree of trying to engage intermarried families in Jewish life. Indeed, I think there are reasons to be optimistic. In Boston, a recent study of intermarried couples showed that 60% of the children of mixed marriage were being raised by Jews, typically with the encouragement and support of the non-Jewish parent. Indeed, in America today, there are literally tens of thousands of children of mixed marriage who are being raised as Jews with the support of the non-Jewish spouse. And I'm sure probably many of you today, or at least with the audience, perhaps with a younger audience, for the Hunter student body, I'm sure many of them are people who identify themselves as Jewish and have a parent who is not. In fact, I'm happy to report that our grandson, Eli Olcott, now 13, celebrated his bar mitzvah this past spring. I also can report anecdotally, when Allison told me that it meant a lot to Corey that their son be named Cornelius, I said to her, Allie, you know that the Jewish tradition, you don't name a kid after a living relative. And she said, oh, Dad, we're not going to really call him Cornelius. That'd be much too presumptuous. We're going to call him Eli. That Eli is the name of Dale's then deceased father. I knew I had been out negotiated once I was told that. The third and fourth challenges that I identify in the book, the first two being a decline in observance, the second being this remarkable increase in intermarriage. I'll let you guess who those people are. Has to do, a third challenge really has to do with Israel. And I'm not going to elaborate here But I simply want to say that in my generation, for many of us growing up, part of our American Jewish identity was a sense of pride for Israel. And support for Israel was long thought to be an element that for American Jews would help hold us together. I think it's fair to say today that policies of the Israeli government pose an enormous challenge to the American Jewish world. If you talk to Reform and conservative rabbis about the risks on the pulpit of giving sermons relating to Israel, it's like the third rail. Because on the one hand, the overwhelming majority of American Jews are liberals and feel some discomfort with the continuing occupation and the treatment of Palestinians. And also, only 10% of us are Orthodox, and we feel anger at the regular statements by the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel who characterize many of us as really not counting as Jewish because we're not Orthodox enough. Anyway, my book talks about these Israeli issues. I'm not going to elaborate now here, except to say I deal with them. The fourth issue I deal with has to do with anti-Semitism. Only a fool would claim after Pittsburgh and Charlottesville that there's no anti-Semitism in America. That's crazy. Many still hold in their heads various Jewish stereotypes, which may be anti-Semitic. And there are fringe political groups who are really old-fashioned anti-Semites in a fascistic way. Then there are those on the left who are very unhappy with Israel, and sometimes their rhetoric is characterized as anti-Semitic. What I believe, however, is that although historically, this is part of the paradox, anti-Semitism and the fear of anti-Semitism is part of what held the tribe together. I think that for my children and grandchildren's generation in America, I'm not saying this worldwide, anti-Semitism is largely irrelevant. In their lives, indeed, the thing that is striking to me is during my lifetime, there have been the most stunning changes in terms of American acceptance of Jews. And I think we should be certainly aware and vigilant in terms of anti-Semitism. But this is a picture. That little kid it is I when I was 3, and that's one of my grandfathers. That's George Sittenfeld in front of their home in Kansas City. When my grandfather bought that house in 1925, it was a very nice house. It was in what's called the Country Club District. The Country Club District was restricted. He was able to buy it only because he used a straw. I went to a boys' school in Kansas City, Pembroke Country Day School. It had a quota. When I went to Harvard College, there were final clubs that excluded Jews. There'd never been a president of Harvard that was Jewish. Indeed, there really hadn't been any Jews who were president of any of the Ivy League schools, or for that many other universities either. In short, during my lifetime, early in my life, there were still not only country clubs that were restricted, but vacation places that were restricted. There was a vast amount of discrimination. For my grandchildren, their educational, social, economic, and political opportunities, in my view, are unaffected if they want to take pride and identify themselves as Jewish. That is remarkable, and it's something we should celebrate. And I think that although it's important that we keep our eye on the risks of anti-Semitism raising its ugly head again, and there are real problems in Europe, America, I think, is quite exceptional, and we should celebrate it. I think that what I'd like to conclude by saying is in the book, I end up suggesting that a new standard and a new way of thinking about who should be counted as part of the American Jewish community. And indeed, what I propose is what I call the Big Tent approach. Now, in the Big Tent approach, my idea is if someone wants to be part of the American Jewish community as a whole, it requires only one thing, that they publicly self-identify themselves as Jewish. That they say they want to be and are a member of the American Jewish community. I'm not going to quiz them about whether their mother or father was, and I'm also not going to ask them whether they went through a formal religious conversion. Footnote: in the early days of Israel, under their law of return, guess what the standard was for whether you were admitted to Israel, were subsidized with housing and everything else? First 10 years. Self-identification. That changed politically. Once it was made explicit, the Ministry of Justice said that was the standard. All hell broke loose and things are a bit more restrictive. Under the Big Tent, I have to say, there are this remarkable variety of Jewish institutions, some religious, many non-religious. And my own feeling, because I am a liberal, is each of these institutions under the Big Tent can set its own standards. If Orthodox Judaism wants it to have a very restrictive standard, so be it. If a Jewish film festival, a Jewish community center, if a Jewish federation wants to welcome those who want to identify as part of it without any questions as to how they identify, I think that would be great too. And I think the challenge is to encourage people to explore the extraordinary variety of activities and ways people can express being Jewish under the Big Tent. I hope you read the book. I hope you find it interesting, and most of all, what I hope is to promote a discussion. So I'd be glad to take a few questions. Thank you.
Wait for the microphone and I will choose you. It'll be a difficult choice, I'm sure, but I am embracing choice in a changing world, according to the subtitle of the book. So your questions for Professor Mnookin?
It was a fantastic lecture. The second time we heard a lecture by a chair at Harvard University Law School. The last one was the Dean's Professor of Harvard Law School, Sohn. Professor Sohn. I really enjoyed it, but the only problem I have is your fourth point on anti-Semitism. I don't think you appreciate the reality of American life today. In '68, we had a fanatic by the name of George Wallace, who was a racist. I don't know if he's anti-Semitic or not. And I heard him speak in Chicago. And it was a frightening event. We have a president of the United States that in his final PR piece when he's running for election almost quoted the elders of Zion. He's the president of the United States. He won't condemn the KKK and the Nazis. And he tweets material from white supremacists. I think your grandchildren are threatened.
I'm certainly not going to defend President Trump. And I'm certainly not going to defend his tweets or his initial response to Charlottesville. I think what's also useful to observe is after Charlottesville, the congressional condemnation of the neo-Nazis, which was unanimous as a resolution. And the fact that in America, there really were, Trump notwithstanding, I do not think either of the political parties in any way is really embracing anti-Semitism. I mean, my deepest concern is what Trump does, the way he demonizes immigrants and the Muslim community. And I think particularly as Jews, I feel we have a deep responsibility to fight back against that. And I don't want to say, only a fool would say there are no anti-Semites in America. There are, but I think they do not have significant political power. And I hope your prediction's wrong, and I hope my optimism is correct, but the future's hard to tell.
I agree wholeheartedly that those who self-identify as Jews are Jews. However, I think that we must go one step farther. Because of the problem of anti-Semitism, if we are to be realistic, we have to realize that we have to protect Judaism and Israel. And therefore, if one person says, well, I'm Jewish, and then does nothing to support Jewish organizations that offer philanthropy to poor Jews, to organizations that support Jewish education, etc., then that person to me, and you're going to think this is too harsh. Okay, so the question is, how do you get Jews to do more than simply say I'm Jewish, but to support Israel, Judaism, and the promotion of Jewish values?
I think that's a fair question, because it's one thing for someone to self-identify, but a friend of mine who's an Israeli posed really a deep question. And he said, in what way does being Jewish affect how you're living your life? Now, my own view is it can affect how you're living your life, even if you're critical of Israel. Indeed, I think many Israelis, I am very supportive of the survival of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. But I think the attempt to silence those of us who are critical of Israeli policies is a terrible mistake. And it's happening within the American Jewish community. So I think the Israel issue is a complicated one, but I personally am supportive. With respect, at the end of the book, I asked myself, well, how would I explain to my grandchildren why it's important, what it means to me to be Jewish? I end up encapsulating it by saying, I'm committed to the idea of the Jewish head, the Jewish heart, and the Jewish heritage. By head, what I mean is that we're people of the book, and that, in fact, although there are many peoples who are intellectually committed and value debate and argument, it's been part of our culture and our civilization for a long, long time, and I identify that with it. The Jewish heart, although my doctrinal religious education in Kansas City was thin, I was raised on the idea of tikkun olam, and that I grew up believing that I had an obligation to help make the world better, to help heal the world, not just for Jews, but for society generally. And I take enormous pride in the philanthropic efforts of American Jews across the board in supporting all kinds of philanthropic, political, and other, I'll use the word, liberal activities. And I think it's not an accident that leaders in the women's movement and the ACLU and all, you can look at most reform movements, and there are a lot of Jews who are active. I see that as an expression of their Jewishness too. And the third thing is the Jewish heritage, and that is I hope that my grandchildren learn more than I learned growing up before I did the research for this book about our heritage and the story, including the story of Jews in America. It's an amazing story. And that heritage is something I also take pride in. So, in all events, you posed a great question, and it is a challenge. And the thing I think is, if you look at America and you ask, there's no one way to be Jewish. There's this extraordinary variety of ways people are expressing that strand of their identity. And I think that's part of what's so extraordinary about our American Jewish community.
Professor Mnookin, thank you for your presentation tonight. The book is a compelling read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Could you talk a little bit more about what you see as the barrier or the challenge to actually filling up that big tent that you have, the empty one that's up there? What is it that is prevalent in the American Jewish community, or that gets in the way of that happening?
Well, I think one of the challenges, and it really motivated me to write the book, is avoidance. Now, I'm speaking a little bit of my own generation, all right? The overwhelming majority of our friends have children who have married non-Jews. And because I'm working on this book and thinking about Jewish identity, I often ask, well, have you talked to your kids? And what are you talking to your grandchildren about in terms of if and how it's important to you that you think of yourself as Jewish? And what I'm hoping my book does is stimulate people to do that more, because I think certainly parents can make a big difference. Grandparents can too, and I tell some stories of grandparents who I think are making quite a remarkable difference. But part of it, and see, it's generational. What strikes me is in America today, notwithstanding there being some crazy anti-Semites, there's no cost to taking pride and proudly identifying yourself as Jewish. That was not true in my youth. It was not true in my parents' generation, much less my grandparents' generation. And so in that sense, I sort of I say, what are you afraid of, right? If it's important to you. So I think that's one thing that can be done, that I think our generation has that challenge. I think the other challenge is that I think in terms of Jewish philanthropy and activities, I think it's wonderful that we're supportive of Israel, but I think it's terribly important to really provide a variety of institutions through which people can express their identity that don't have to do with Israel. But I don't have the answer. I mean, I'm not sure there is an answer. But I really am, I think the American Jewish community is stunningly vibrant. And to the same degree that many of us Americans aren't too knowledgeable about Israel. I've actually been to Israel a lot of times because I've done a lot of work on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you can see how successful I've been. I'm sitting by the phone waiting for the Nobel call. It hasn't come yet. But Israelis, for the most part, are unbelievably ignorant about the breadth, variety, and scope of the American community. Part of it, according to Zionist ideology, America is impossible. We're doomed. Because Zionist ideology traditionally said either anti-Semitism means that it's going to be impossible to be a Jew, or you will be assimilated away. Now, I think in America, I don't think either is going to happen. The second, there's a risk, but I'm so struck by how many, as I said, children of those who are intermarried are deeply committed to being Jews.
Um, we belong to a synagogue that has spent all of last year dealing with this issue and trying to figure out, a conservative synagogue,
Conservative movement's struggling right
yeah, of how to deal with it, and came to similar conclusions about the need for outreach and for accepting people and for creating a different standard of Jewishness, what it means to be Jewish. My husband and I have a son, and we struggled very hard to bring him up in a Jewish, quote-unquote, atmosphere. And actually, it worked. I think somewhat to my surprise, given some of his rebellions. But it really took a conscious effort.
Right.
And what strikes me about what you're saying is how your daughter had a Jewish consciousness without having been raised with, going to a day school, going to Jewish summer camps, all of those, without belonging to a synagogue, all of those activities. And so what do you think it is that does keep that alive in young people who were not raised in what we think of as a Jewish home?
Well, I think, first of all, I think my daughters are both exceptional, and that's obviously, like most parents, I think that. But I think one thing that's important is when there is the spark, to encourage it and to help them pursue it. And I think many are curious. I have a chapter in the book, and it does not describe what we did, because with the benefit of hindsight, there are things I wish we had done that we didn't do. I mean, for example, I think, and the reform movement's encouraging this much more now, but celebrating Shabbat on a weekly basis, I think, is a wonderful way to do it, and where it doesn't have to necessarily be terribly religious. But I think the challenge for those of us who are not conventionally observant, and for whom the liturgy, I wish it did. In the last chapter I say, I wish the religious services turned me on. No, I'm serious, because religion is a very powerful mechanism to transmit this stuff. But like many other Americans who proudly identify as Jews, it doesn't. And so then the question is, well, what are you going to do? And that is a challenge. That is a challenge. And I think, as I say, that's what the book struggles with, how we should do that. Yep.
Oh, thank you. All right, two quick things. This morning I happened to be watching television as I'm doing my stuff in the house, and they showed a chart talking about hate crimes, not necessarily, against Jews, just hate crimes in general.
Right.
It happened that during the years of Obama's administration, they were at their lowest on this chart, and guess what? It has spiked.
Yes.
I can't imagine why it has spiked, but we can all guess why. All right, that's one thing. Secondly, my sister has been married to a Sephardic Jew for 60 years, and I have to tell you, they name after the living. I don't want you to send out wrong information. Sephardic Jews name after the living.
So do Ashkenazi Jews.
I know, but but it's standard with
I know.
the Spanish background, the Turkish
Right.
background. But just wanted to get it out there.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Robert Mnookin, and please join us for a reception and book signing just outside the auditorium.